Good day. I'm proud to welcome you again to the next in our studies on good women in God's Word. I'm here in the cathedral rooms, what we call it, upstairs in the activity building. Among the things that take place here, our royal ambassadors meet in this space on Wednesday evening, studying about missions, and this is kind of a mission-minded story. It seems a fitting place because this story has some international ramifications outside of Israel, which is where the focus is, of course, in most of the ministries and stories of the Old Testament. I hope that you have an outline. They're all available on our website. Just download them, print them out, follow along. If you need a printout that the church can supply for you, please let us know, and we will take care of that. As you'll see here in our 11th study, that we are looking at a lady we call the Widow of Zarephath. Her story is found in 1 Kings chapter 17, and it carries with it really the word of identification of desperation. I call it dealing with desperation. Have you really ever felt desperate, just dire life and death desperation? Many years ago, we had a youth group that was going out on mission trip, I believe it's during the summer, and our church van wasn't functioning and couldn't make the trip. And at the last minute, we're trying to figure out how are we going to transport these young adults to do the ministry. So we're pondering, calling. It's difficult to find a rental van. I happen to know that there was a rental van that was on the lot at Don Ledford Chevrolet up the street on the highway. And I knew Don Ledford Sr., so I went to see him, and I said, Mr. Ledford, you would be doing us a great favor. We need a rental van. Could you help us out in some way with this? And he pondered. They occasionally had rented vehicles. He didn't like doing it, and he was worried, frankly, about the liability of a bunch of teenagers in a van. If they had a wreck, would he be held liable? It was he hemmed and hawed a little bit, and I was trying to convince him as best I could to help us out. And I said, Don, please help us. I'm desperate. And he stopped and he looked me right in the eye across his desk, and he said, Jay, you've never been desperate a day in your life. And we had, in the midst of this other conversation, we had this kind of profound moment, because I have to admit, he was right. I really wasn't desperate in the extreme definition of it, and I've never been desperate, and many of you would say the same. We always knew we had a roof over our head, we had food on our table, we had the love of family and friends, we had some things for helping us in times. So the desperation in this story is something primarily we just have to imagine. One other thing before we get into the heart of the story, I just want to mention this is the first in these 11 ladies that we've looked at. The first one that doesn't have a name in the Bible. We just know her as the Widow of Zarephath. I wish I knew her name because I think she is a great example of faith in dire circumstances, but we don't know. So it won't be the last of these ladies that we look at that we don't have a name for in the Bible, but it is the first. And her story is a part of the larger story there in the middle chapters of 1 Kings of Elijah the prophet. And so we're going to see what brought about some, in the first spot on your outline is dire circumstances. Just these desperate circumstances is the word that they faced. And the second letter down there is the word drought. A severe drought. I mean, we don't like a drought now, but we have some things and ways of working in water control and TVA and the dam system and things that help us make it minimal if we have a long season without rain. In the Middle East in ancient days, it was a tough thing. And so we find in the midst of Elijah's story, it says sometime later the brook dried up, and this was a little brook that was sustaining Elijah the prophet because there had been no rain in the land. And the reason there had been no rain in the land is because Elijah had declared there would be no rain in the land. It was a time when the northern nation of the Hebrews called Israel was under the leadership of a king named Ahab and his better known wife Jezebel. And Jezebel especially was driving the worship of the pagan god Baal and the female equivalent Asherah. It was watering down and compromising the faith of the Hebrew people. And so kind of one of those get your attention moments. Elijah declares it's not going to rain until he says so, and he is the prophet of the one true God. And so it did not. Now, I have a map I'll show you a couple of times, and the brook that dries up that had been supplying for Elijah is right here by a place called Tishbe on the western side of, the eastern side of the Jordan River. And he's kind of hiding out there. God's supplying him food. Ravens are bringing him food. The stream there is providing some meals for him. But that's the situation that they were in, not only in Israel, but in the whole region, even up in Zarephath, where we'll see the widow here in a moment. And just to point out that a widow had a tough life. If there wasn't a husband, if there wasn't then a son or a father or a male figure who could earn a living, because there were a few careers that were eligible for the ladies, then they really had a tough time, and they had an especially tough time in drought, because as the drought got worse, the productivity of the land dried up, and there was just less to be shared around and folks to be generous with and help those in need. So it was a desperate time, we'd see, for her. And the drought then lead to what she was really facing was an inevitable, and the word is starvation, doing without food at all. God makes a surprising request to Elijah here in Tishbe as he's kind of hiding out, but the stream dries up and it's time for him to move on. And where does God send him? Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called to her and asked, would you bring me a little jug of water that I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Now, I want to go back to my map in just a minute, because it reads really casually. Go over to Zarephath, like it's the next village over, it's down the street someplace. And again, Elijah is over here in Tishbe, but Zarephath is way up here to the north. It is in what today is the nation of Lebanon. 100 miles by foot. How long would it take you to walk 100 miles? A while. Let's just face that. So it's a long journey that he takes, that he goes to this place. And when he stands before this widow, he probably looks like a prophet. There were certain clothings they wore to identify them, even though he wasn't a prophet of her land. But he would have been tired, he would have been dirty, he's been disheveled, he would have been troubled in a lot of ways, his feet tired, his beard gnarly. He wouldn't have been a very pretty sight there after a 100-mile walk. And now he is asking her for water, which seemed something she was going to give, but she stops in her tracks when he asks that she would make him a little bread to eat. He says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, so recognizing the Lord, your Hebrew, your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar, a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. What a heartbreaking story, situation to be in. Desperate circumstances, wouldn't you say? We have just enough for one more meal, a little meal, small meal, and after that there'll be nothing, and we'll just have to wait till nature takes its course and starvation takes place. Now, we don't know much about desperation, and we probably know little to nothing about starvation, at least on a personal way. I remember when I was just a little boy, probably only 5 or 6 years old, in the kitchen with my mom. She's fixing supper. I'm in a hurry. I'm kind of hungry. And I say, go on, Mom, when are we going to eat? I'm starving. And my mother stopped and turned and looked me square in the eye. And she says, there are starving children in this world, and you're not one of them. And I do not think I've ever referred to myself as starving again. My mom taught me a very good lesson. We can imagine it. We can see stories about starvation. We can kind of know maybe even what it looks like, but we don't experience that personally. At least most of us have not. But there's not only the starvation here physically, but here's a lady who has the starvation of hope, that she doesn't have any hope in rain coming and making life better for everybody, and hopefully for her. She doesn't have hope that some neighbor or relative is going to show enough compassion to help her out. And really on a lot of levels here, she is starving. And Elijah shows up and seemingly to ask what would be the impossible for her to give with the little means that she has. So we have different situations, circumstances, but we also then see some desperate faith. In a desperate time, she shows some faith in this foreign prophet in what he says, because she has just told him, I don't have enough food except for one more little meal for me and my son. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make me a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And I underline there the words, from what you have. A little reminder, God doesn't ask you for what you don't have, but he has every right to ask you what you do have, because every good and perfect gift came from above. And so he has given it to you. And even if it's all you have, all the little that you have, he has the right to say, here's a way I want you to use it. Here's a way I want you to entrust me with it. And so it goes on. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, he's not in Israel, but he's saying the God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain from the land. And it's asking her, I want you to do something desperate in faith. You don't think you have enough left except just for you and your son, but you take care of me, and there's going to be a supply that is going to be taken care of. Now, as I said, she's not from Israel. She's not a follower of the Hebrew God, but she is being asked to trust the word of the prophet of the Hebrew God. And so there's a significant step of faith in her desperate time that she is willing to make, because she only had enough left for herself. Again, it's something that's hard for us to even imagine. I was at a financial seminar one time about how to try to make your budget balance, and if you're in a time when you are trying to save some money, or you're need to make sure you don't spend more than you do. And one of the suggestions was, it's a short-term thing, just eat out of your cabinets. And what that meant was just eat the food in your house right now. You're tempted to go out to eat, you're tempted to go to the store and buy more things, but just what do you got? And so I asked a question there, and it's just kind of an interesting question. How many days could you eat with just the food that is in your house right now? Could you make it a week, some a month, some 3 months, maybe even longer? Could be. What an interesting thing to know how much we've managed to store up. But what if you only had enough for one more meal? What if that was it? And then somehow God said, I want you to do that. Can we trust God when we are most desperate? Can we trust God when we are most needy? Can we instead of saying, Lord, I'll give you from my surplus, can you say, I'll give you from what essentially I think I absolutely need right now, from my scarcity? I think it's wise to say, if you won't give God out of your scarcity, you probably won't give to him out of your abundance. You might say you will, but start with the scarcity even so, and ask for those things, and be willing to give to them. And so it says, a very simple statement about her, doesn't it? She went away and did as Elijah told her. And it doesn't give details. I like to try to imagine this. Here she is, the last little bit of food that she has, the oil and the grain. She makes this little bread. Elijah just nearby, sitting there maybe in her own house, and puts it in front of him, and he eats every bite right in front of her, the last of her food, her and her poor little boy there that's in the house too. And it must have been really tough. Really tough to have. This is supposed to be mine. It was my last meal, and I'm giving it away, even to what seemed like a man of God. What a tough thing. But that little expression of faith, really a desperate expression of faith, goes a long, long way. There was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family, for the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord spoke by Elijah. It was the multiplication of food. It was like the Old Testament equivalent of the feeding of the 5,000, the multiplication of the fish and the loaves. Here you have the multiplication of the oil and of the flour, and so that it would survive them through that. We are concerned at times if we'll have enough. Is there enough food in the house? Is there enough money in the bank to get me through retirement or to have my kids' college education paid for? Is there enough time for something? But I just put a little note there. From God's perspective, scarcity is a myth. He doesn't have the experience of worrying about scarcity, of not having enough of something. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and the hills that the cattle are on. He doesn't have to worry about scarcity of things. And that's our God, who can supply all our needs according to his riches in Christ Jesus. So just a little reminder, we can take those steps of faith even when it seems to be something that is asking a lot, because we don't seem like we have a little or very little to give, and take care of it because he has no scarcity. He has nothing that he'll ever run out of. We come to the next point, and that would be a nice place to finish the story, and in some of my sermons I have. But we're talking about this lady, and so her story and experience continues in that chapter. But I want us to focus, we've talked about her desperate situation and her desperate faith, but I want to look at desperate ministry to see how Elijah responds when the next crisis falls their way. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" What a passionate expression that we can unpack for a little bit. Feeling her pain. My son is dead. You thought you had dodged the starvation and got away from that. Now he dies of something else. You get your hopes back up, and now they're crushed below you. You can kind of experience the pain that's taken place. The deepest earthly grief that I know of is for a parent to lose a child. I've not known any kind of grief that I've witnessed that is heavier. And so she's experiencing that. Experience her anger because she says to Elijah, "What do you have against me?" Well, we'll see in the story, he's brokenhearted too over this. He has nothing against her. He's only brought good to her. She's acted in faith. But sometimes in our deepest emotions, we can lash out in anger against an innocent party. It's a bit of a version of you have a bad day at work and you come home and you take it out on your family. She's hurting, and so she's speaking out against Elijah at this point. You can taste her guilt. Did you come to remind me of my sin? And we all have sin. Let's admit, we all have shortcomings. We're honest of ourselves. We do. And one of the things when hard times come in our thoughts, and she's verbalizing it here, what did I do to bring this on? What mistakes have I made? What is God punishing me for in my life? And so she's going through all of these natural emotions that take place in crisis and mourning, in trauma that goes on. She's honest about that thing. But Elijah's sharing in her burden, and then he acts upon it in, again, I call it desperate ministry. Look at the lengths that he goes to. "Give me your son," Elijah replied, and he took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" And he stretched himself on the boy 3 times, cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And I hope you can sense and read that with some passion. The desperation that Elijah is expressing here, the desperation of his prayer that goes on. I asked the question, have you ever prayed a desperate prayer for God to make something better? And a lot of times you probably have. When there's just no other answer, there's nothing else you can do. The only hope is if God intervenes. And so in those times, those crushing times, those desperate times, we are times to pray earnestly. We've had the adage, desperate times call for desperate measures. As people of faith say, desperate times call for desperate prayers. And we can pray with that kind of passion that we take place here. One other thing, and I want to give credit to Jeff Mowry, who, when we were sharing this together, pointed this out, that Elijah, lays and touches this dead boy's body. And a reminder, in the Old Testament law, in the Mosaic law, you weren't supposed to touch a dead body. It would make you ceremonially unclean. But he is going against the Old Testament law in his passion and his desperation. So earnest is he in his desire for some good to take place. And it says, the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house and gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. It's like the second time. He was almost dead from starvation and the drought, and then he was dead. And for the second time, Elijah's presence has brought some life back into this boy in the most difficult, dire of circumstances. So we appreciate his desperate ministry. At times God will call us to have that passionate desperation in prayer and other expressions for good things to take place in difficult times. I want to close with just noting, because this is the story of the widow of Zarephath, and just to note that God cares for desperate people. We find that throughout the Bible, that compassion for the poor and the broken and the outcast. We find it throughout, don't we? The ministry of Jesus, the advocate and the hero of the little guy, the forgotten guy, the people that everybody else has given up on. And one of the consistent categories of the neediest people in the Bible are the widows and orphans. And so I'm just going to kind of break through a few suggested verses here that illustrate that. First, God's compassion for the widows and orphans. He declares it in the Psalm 68 and Psalm 146, that God is a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, and God is God in his holy dwelling. In the next passage, the Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. It is at the heart of God for the needy, and especially in the illustration here, the widows and the orphans. We're made in the image of God. Part of that is we reflect the same priorities and values that God has, and he values the widows and orphans and their need. So we should too. And so he expects that of his people, and when they don't, you can get called out for it. And so I said he declares it in the Psalm. He demands it in the prophets. 3 places here in the prophets, I'll read you a moment, where the prophets say among the shortcomings of God's people was they haven't taken care of the widows and the orphans. And these are 3 different prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel and Malachi, who speak to God's people in 3 different generations. In Isaiah, in the early part of the time of the kings, in Ezekiel, in the exile, and after the exile in Malachi. But they all are making the same mistake, right? Speaking to the rulers. The rulers do not defend the cause of the fatherless, the orphans. The widow's case does not come before him. There's some things they should do to bring about justice, and they're not meeting their responsibilities. In Ezekiel, in you they have oppressed the foreigner, mistreated who? The fatherless and the widow. And then Malachi giving a whole list of things that generation had missed out on. So I will come put you on trial. I will be quick to testify against, and here's the list: sorcerers, adulterers, perjurers, against those who defraud laborers their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, who, get, I don't say wealthy, or benefit on the backs of the helpless and the poor. And what a sad thing that is. And then he calls on it from the church. This is the New Testament place that we find together. And again, the life of Jesus illustrates that. In Acts chapter 15, there is some working together between the Gentile Christians and the Hebrew Christians. And one of the things they agree upon is everybody's got to be compassionate toward the poor. It's consistent with that. And then there's a simple definition of pure and faultless religion we find in the book of James. Religion, God, our Father, accepts as pure and faultless is this. What is it? To look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So it's almost like 2 acts in one. If you are compassionate for the poorest among you, I won't worry too much about you getting corrupted by the world, because your focus and your vision is on the right thing. And so that's called upon. I remember that was a verse 30 years ago when we were starting the child care ministry, and we don't really have in our culture the traditional widows and orphans, but we do have single moms, and we've got families who need a caring, loving place to take care of the little ones while they do work and make their ends meet. And so that was something I think we're going to try to meet a need in our community, and it has consistently lasted, now for well over 30 years. So we have that calling upon us. We can't, oftentimes there are ways in our society when a widow occurs, when a death occurs to a husband, there might be life insurance, there can be Social Security. The financial need might have some means of care, but there is companionship, there is friendship to help deal with the loneliness. There might have been duties and responsibilities that a husband took care of, the heavy lifting, the yard work, whatever it was. Good Christian friends and stuff can be compassionate and step up and care in those times of need. So just to bring that up to say that even though the widows and orphans of today are a different look than they were in the Bible times, they're still there. The needy are around us, and we can help out. One other thing about this character, this Widow of Zarephath, she makes a New Testament appearance, or at least a reference we find in the book of Luke, the 4th chapter. It is when Luke is in his hometown in Nazareth, and he's really kind of calling out some of the arrogance of the people who think, well, I'm a Hebrew, I'm the right bloodline, so I'm right with God and everybody else isn't. And they need to be more like us, and only the Hebrew people are the ones who can be right with God. And so Jesus is calling that out a bit, and he's ruffling some feathers there in Nazareth. He says, "Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown." And he's living that out right now, that adage. "I assure you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, and when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land, yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon." So that's the place where God saw somebody who had the faith that could respond and help his prophet out and be a living example, and through inspiration of Scripture, continuing on for us. Again, in Israel's time, people were watering down their worship of the Lord, worshiping God, but also we're going to worship Baal too. It's the god of fertility, and hope it'll bring rain and fruitfulness and good crops to our land. And so, there were many, I'm sure, needy ladies in that time, like Jesus said, but God says, there's a person in Sidon. There's this widow, and he's just kind of saying, that God's care is for beyond just our little clique and our little circle of folks like us and our family and our bloodline like that was taking place there. He goes on with another Old Testament example from Elisha and from Naaman, who was cleared of his leprosy. He also was a foreigner who saw the power and the grace of God come with him. And so there's a little bit of a reference there, but Jesus kind of holds her up in good esteem as somebody of faith who was kind of an outsider but recognized the God of Israel and responded to that. Just as a reminder in desperation there that God never lacks anything. He's never in any scarcity. He is a supply of all of our needs that we have. And I put a quote there at the bottom of your listening guide. It comes from Elizabeth Elliot. Elizabeth and Jim Elliot, 100 years ago, were in South America dealing with indigenous people, trying to introduce some native tribes to the gospel. Jim Elliot died in that as a martyr. You can read their story in Through Gates of Splendor. It's a book that Elizabeth Elliot wrote. It's been a long-term classic Christian writing. You can also see a movie called The Other End of the Spear that tells this story too. And so herself, she's a widow here, Elizabeth Elliot was. She has this: God's work in God's way never lacks God's supply. So let's remember that. Elijah's learning that. This widow is learning that. And the times we learn that the most are in the desperate times. I don't wish desperate times on you. I don't wish desperate times on me. But it is in our desperation that we can practice some of the strongest expressions of our faith in God, and we can receive some of the deepest assurances of His compassionate care and His all-sufficient supply. Thank you for sharing with me. I look forward to meeting with you again in this way in our next lesson. God bless.